Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Andy, how are you, buddy?
Oh, I am great. I was in your fair city last week. Headed back to your fair city this week for a lacrosse game, not for any sort of Florida State related material. But talked to DJU, got a chance to meet up with him, and was very, very impressed. But we got to talk about what happened Friday, Jeff. Like, is it possible the ACC is willing to negotiate with Florida State?
Seems like it. Andy, listen, I think you and I, since the beginning, have kind of felt like at some point that's what would happen. And I'm not a lawyer, and I try to read into page upon page upon page of the filings at this point. And you do get a sense that although it's vitriolic, although there's a ton of pettiness involved in all of it, you understand that is the legal wrangling. That is the stuff that they have to do. And one side will submit their reasons for dismissal, and then the next will do that within the respective states. But I do think that's where this is headed, and I think that's where Florida State always wanted it to head. There was no way they were going to fight to get out if they thought that they were going to legitimately have to pay $500+ million to do so. I don't believe they ever intended to do that. I don't think that the courts would uphold that. They don't either. And I think at some point that leads to a negotiation.
Yeah, so here's what it said in the filing. It's interesting because what the ACC was filing, and remember, there's two cases. There's one in North Carolina that the ACC filed. There's one in Florida that Florida State filed. So this is in the one in Florida, and the ACC submitted this early Friday afternoon, and it's basically saying here's why the case should not be tried in Florida. It should be tried in North Carolina, and then a couple of other arguments which are actually kind of interesting and probably support the ACC's argument. Like they've spent a lot of time saying, well, Florida State took delivery on the deal. They took the money these past 8 years from the contract. So therefore, it's not the rotten deal that they say it is. But here's the little nugget. And shout out to Matt Baker from the Tampa Bay Times, who found this first and put a story out immediately and really good job alerting everybody to this. This is the clause in that argument. There's 40 pages of filing.
Yeah.
But this is the paragraph that is the most meaningful. If Florida State wishes to regain control of the rights, this is the TV rights, before the end of the term, it could attempt to repurchase them. But having to buy back a right which was assigned is not a penalty. It is simply a commercial possibility. What a turn of phrase. A commercial possibility. So if you were to have a commercial possibility, then you could conceivably have this much money, and this is the amount we'll take. Now, you mentioned $500+ million, Jeff. When Florida State filed its initial complaint, its attorneys estimated it would cost $572 million, which is the exit fee from the ACC plus what they assume to be the cost of the TV rights through 2036. So where do you think Florida State's mind is at in terms of what a fair dollar figure would be to get out?
Well, it's interesting to speculate. I have an idea based on conversations that I've had with people behind the scenes in the past, but I will tell you this, even without speculation, they've thrown around numbers in open conversations and open dialogue. In fact, at one point, Peter Collins, department chair, said that basically, chair of the board of trustees, that if this were only $150 million, Florida State would have left already. So we know they'd pay $150 million. So he basically all but admitted that. Andy, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 million. I think if tomorrow they knew that was the number and they could be free to negotiate with either the Big Ten or the SEC and move on from the ACC, I think they would do it.
Well, and I think this also sets up something else interesting because, like, they didn't have to put this into this filing. This did not have to be submitted in a public document, it's a public record. And because if I'm Clemson or if I'm North Carolina and I have the same goals as Florida State, I've just gone about it a different way. Now I'm looking at it like, okay, what do we have to do to negotiate this? And I would assume the ACC knows that.
Yeah, and I think it's odd that if the ACC, listen, Andy, if Florida State leaves the ACC and it opens the door, as you're suggesting, for North Carolina and Clemson to do the same, the conference dead in the water. There have been people that said the conference is dead, walking around just doesn't know it yet. I mean, I thought that this would go to the bitter end to some extent, because I think that the ACC has hinted as much that losing FSU at this point, or North Carolina or Clemson, if you'd like, it's just that Florida State's been the most aggressive, is akin to dissolving the contract with ESPN. Who's signing up for that television contract without your major players?
Yeah, and the only thing I can think is they're looking at this as a potential cash infusion. Like, if they could get $300 million from each school, which is a lot of money, but we'll talk about that in a second, because it's not as much as you think in the grand scheme.
Right.
That's basically, if it's those three, that's basically almost $1 billion cash, which time value of money, if you handle that properly, you can keep the corpse of that conference afloat for quite some time.
But to what end? I mean, it's interesting. You're right. You could. It certainly does not become the viable asset to ESPN or to anybody else negotiating a long-term television deal down the line without a Clemson, without a Florida State, or without a North Carolina. You're right. It just becomes an also-ran conference, which is what I thought this was about, that we were going to get to a place where I never – listen, we could go down this road. You and I talked about this a lot. Jim Phillips never, in my opinion, seemed to understand the way this was going to play out and how aggressive his competitors were. And that, I think, there was a little naivete there. He wanted to believe in the greater good, and yet there was overwhelming evidence from his cohorts like Greg Sankey that they were out for blood. This was a race to see who wins the conference war. And to Sankey's credit, he has lobbied on behalf of the SEC around every turn. He has struck the better deals, and he has taken the opportunities where PR advancements could be made to do so. And Jim Phillips kind of calmly told everybody things were going to be fine in the ACC, and we believe that where we stand is rock solid. I don't know that he believes that. I don't know that the ACC believes that any longer.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think you're putting that into that filing if you believe that. I think you're now preparing for the inevitable. And it's so interesting to me, Jeff, because you've dealt with this conference for a long time. Jim Phillips' successor, John Swofford, was perhaps the best at that clandestine, cutthroat, go get what you got to get. Or think about this. If John Swofford acts like Jim Phillips did, and Mike Tranghese acts like John Swofford did, the Big East would be a power conference in football, and the ACC probably wouldn't even exist right now. Like, that the ACC exists because John Swofford recognized that football was going to drive the train and went and got what they needed to survive.
Yeah, I'll tell you this, Andy, though, where this thing turned for me, and we agree to some degree on that. That is a factual statement you just made. There are some other missteps along the way from John Swofford. Many who are the pro football people, and I'm not talking about professional football, people who saw that the ACC needed to hitch its wagon to football and not basketball, wished that he had made prior. And there are some dubious deals that were made that were pointed out in the last countersuit by FSU, which, by the way, when they did that, the gloves were off in a way that the genie can never go back in the bottle. I mean, you attack the man's son and his legacy. At that point, we are done dealing here. There was never going to be a negotiation at that point, I wouldn't think. But, these things get ugly, and it got really ugly at that point. When I read through that and saw John Swofford's name mentioned as opposed to the ACC, and when I saw his son's name brought up, I thought, oh, well, they're done. They have decided to go for broke here.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about this, and I think the reason the negotiation part is brought in, although I still wonder why it was brought in now instead of much later in the process, but I don't know that they want to get too much further down the road with this thing. They probably don't want a lot of discovery because that could be embarrassing for both parties.
Correct.
But if it were to go to trial ultimately, the potential ending could be disastrous for both parties, because if the court says, no, the grant of rights is completely enforceable, and if you want to get out of the ACC, you owe $500-something million, well, that's non-starter for Florida State. The other option is the court says the grant of rights is not enforceable at all, and Florida State, you can walk away for nothing, which is a disaster for the ACC. So neither party wants to risk going to trial here. But let's talk about the number, because $300 million is the one I keep coming back to, because it feels like it's sort of the between point between the two polls. But it's also, let's say, and this is a negotiated one, because like if Florida State were to prevail at trial, then their withdrawal from the ACC would be retroactive to last year. They could conceivably be out in time for 2024. That doesn't logistically make a lot of sense. Yeah. But let's say they negotiated an exit for 2025 and it cost $300 million, and they wound up in the Big Ten. Let's just hypothetically, you're going to make probably $40 million more a year there than you would make in the ACC. And so you have 11 years to pay off this mortgage of $300 million.
Right, here you go, right? Yeah.
You're probably going to make a little bit of a profit, like a little tiny bit more once, because there will be interest, and maybe it's private equity paying the freight up front. We'll see. But you're probably going to make a little more if you did that.
I think, yes, there is a magic number, Andy, and I don't know if it's 300 million on the nose, but I think it's fair to speculate on that number for the reasons that you just laid out. It is fascinating to watch this. I have learned over time, you have too, from watching the ugliness of lawsuits and parties who have a lot to gain and a lot to lose. They will say and do almost anything within reason. But I also know that the start of these negotiations eventually are all on behalf of what they know, what's at risk. Like you're saying,
yeah.
The idea that Florida State could walk for nothing is a very real thing. The idea that Florida State could lose and have to pay $500+ million is a very real thing. It's percentages. And I think for Florida State, they've never believed that a court would believe that $500+ million to exit was fair. They would view that as being overly penal. And I think they have evidence to that end. I mean, I think you've watched courts have a hard time with what would be deemed egregious penalties financially for enforcements of grant of rights in the past. So I think they knew that we would be entering a stage similar to the one we're discussing right now the second they filed the lawsuit. I thought the key play long ago was the open Board of Trustees meeting in which they began to discuss a path to leave the ACC, and they noted that it was untenable to stay. The second they said that, you knew what their strategy was, what their efforts were headed towards, and this was all inevitable. And I just never thought that they would pull the trigger as quickly as they did. But once they did, I thought they knew they must have a path to negotiation or an outright exit.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, people keep asking about, do they have a landing spot? I find it very hard to believe that they would do all of this without some idea that there's a landing spot. I tend to think the Big Ten is the spot because the Big Ten would want to move into that territory.
Yeah, I'm curious, Andy, because I want your opinion on this. It's an interesting discussion. The Big Ten would want to plant a flag in the SEC's backyard. They would want to grab it if they could, if it would make sense. If it's all-out war and it's Fox versus ESPN, let's say, would you not, at that point, you'd have a countrywide conference, obviously, as opposed to a regional conference in the SEC. So you would have Florida State, North Carolina, Clemson, potentially Miami. I don't know if they go that route or not, but for the Big Ten. So now we're going coast to coast, and you got all the Midwest to boot. I would think the counter to that is, with the ACC on the verge of dissolving, that ESPN doesn't re-up, and we have to know that by 2026, right? 2025. So I would think at that point, again, SEC, ESPN, Big Ten, Fox, no matter others' feelings, commissioners' feelings, athletic directors' feelings, at some point you would want to counter that move by Fox and the Big Ten if you were ESPN, especially since the ACC will no longer be an asset. And wouldn't you say, you know what, guys, look, this isn't going to, you can be mad if you want to be, if you're Florida or anybody else. We're taking Florida State so that the Big Ten doesn't get them.
Yeah, that's the one thing I would think is the encroachment on the territory piece. Like that's where Clemson would probably find a home in that situation. And Florida State would be the same thing. And I think the part that makes this more interesting is ESPN and Fox are about to go into business together with a streaming service. Like that's where you wonder. And oh, by the way, Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, the two commissioners, just formed an advisory group. So all of this is all happening at once.
Football in mind, Andy, you know they do.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Like, I feel like all of this is related, and like I don't think you can make a deal for because they want to make a deal for the college football playoff, like a new TV deal that extends beyond the 2025 season. I'm not sure they can yet because I don't think they know what these conferences are going to look like.
Correct. You're right. I think. And you were just talking about it before I came in and joined you. I think that's right. I continue to hear rumblings from teams from other conferences saying, well, or commissioners of other conferences saying, whoa, we can't have a deal. We don't know who the players are just yet. We can't have a deal if we don't know who's where. It's crazy. It's fascinating. And I do think this is all related and connected. And once these moves have begun to fall like dominoes, Andy, go back to the lawsuit and then watch what's happened since then. And I'm not saying it's solely because of the lawsuit. I think we were moving inexorably towards this. But, I mean, this is where we were going. And right now it's about divvying up the assets and deciding who's going to play ball and who's not, who wants to be part of this and who wants to go somewhere else and maybe play, for lack of a better term, a lesser brand of football. I mean, the pieces are on the board. There are a lot of assets still to be claimed and fought over here. Once that's done, I think we know it's not like relegation, but I think we're going to find some teams don't want to play big boy football or this brand of football. They don't have the investment or they don't see that as their future, and others still do. And clearly Florida State, along with North Carolina and Clemson, are huge assets to any television deal that you're going to make long-term involving playoff and or super leagues.
Well, especially if you're going to a giant league where most of your games are going to be in that league, most if not all, and you're going to stay in that ecosystem. You're not going to play much outside the ecosystem, and that's the thing that I wonder. Like, how close are we to the SEC and the Big Ten being it? And it feels closer than ever now.
It's funny. I remember having a conversation with an attorney who's kind of connected to the big workings of college football. You know these guys, Andy, and he was saying, because we were Florida State fans were like wringing their hands about what to do, where to go, and how soon could we get there. And we're talking about the value of these assets, just solely looking at programs as assets. And at one point he turned to me and said, this is all hand-wringing. Don't worry about it. Eventually, it's just going to be the SEC and the Big Ten. That is to say ESPN and Fox, and eventually they'll join forces too. So Florida State's going to have a landing spot. Don't worry about it. He said that to me over a year ago.
I mean, it makes sense. And when you see everything kind of the tea leaves coming together, when you see the MAC commissioner saying, hey, don't necessarily believe the reports that we've agreed on a TV deal for the playoff because we haven't. And yeah, because I wouldn't, if I'm them, I don't know that although I guess if I'm the Big 12 and the Group of 5 leagues and the ACC, I would want to sign up for that as quickly as possible to lock myself into some money before things change again.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't disagree with you.
The ACC learned that the hard way with the alliance. So,
well, you're talking about the many missteps along the way, sir. These are the things that I'm referencing when I talk about the naivete of Jim Phillips. Yeah, I agree with you, sir. I think we both know where this is going. But I am fascinated to see who wants to be part of it, who doesn't, who's going to be invited, who's not. I do think for Florida State fans, that have been concerned about this, I do believe this is an inevitability that Florida State will be out. Obviously, I think 2024, they play the schedule they have. It's actually kind of a fun schedule, to be honest with you. You get to go over to Ireland if you're a Florida State fan. You get to go to Notre Dame. You get to host Clemson in Florida. It's a fun schedule. But after that, it may be the last hurrah. I tell people to enjoy it. It's a weird year for FSU because They're going to be doing all the construction on the stadium. Well, they are doing, as you saw, all the
Yeah.
construction on
Oh
the
yeah,
stadium.
it's all cranes in there.
It's all cranes and concrete and empty spaces where seats once sat. And it's interesting to have this, because I do believe it's probably their final year in the conference.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.